October 1944, the Netherlands near Eindhoven. The air was heavy not just with the damp chill of a northern European autumn, but with the suffocating anxiety that precedes a storm. For 5 years, the heel of the Third Reich had pressed down on the flatlands of the Netherlands. The quiet courage of the Dutch resistance was all that buffered the civilians against the crushing reality of occupation, scarcity, and fear. They had lived under the shadow of the Wehrmacht, a disciplined, terrifying, and seemingly omnipresent machine. But now, in the late autumn of 1944, a new sound was replacing the familiar cadence of German boots, a growing, deep, insistent rumble from the south. This was the sound of liberation, the Allied armies pushing northward, a tide of steel and men surging against the crumbling defenses of the Reich. This moment, this fragile bridge between occupation and freedom, is where our story begins. It is a tale not just of tanks and strategic maneuvers, but of human scale. A single massive figure whose sheer presence became a focal point for hope, terror, and the strange distorted reality of wartime perception. The Allied advance was a complex tapestry of logistics and firepower. The drive to free the Netherlands, following the catastrophic failure of Operation Market Garden just weeks earlier, had stalled into a brutal attritional struggle. This was no swift parade. It was a grueling house-to-house, dike-by-dike fight, a slow, muddy churn. The Allied war machine, in its colossal scale, was itself a myth to the Dutch people. They had heard the BBC reports, seen the occasional high-altitude bomber contrails, but the actual American soldier remained an abstract concept, a fighter pilot, a faceless infantryman. They envisioned lean, determined professionals, men engineered for efficiency. What they were not prepared for was the human anomaly that arrived with a scout platoon of the U.S. 3rd Armored Division, pushing through a liberated village near the Meuse River. The date was October 24th. The Germans had retreated in a hurry, leaving behind a trail of spent ammunition and a deep residue of distrust. The first American vehicles to enter were the familiar, rugged jeeps and half-tracks. The soldiers who dismounted were ordinary, tired, and grinning men offering cigarettes and K-rations. Then, stepping out of the last truck, was the man they would come to call De Roos, the giant. He was a private first class named Silas Cy Denton, an engineer assigned to clear obstacles and reinforce bridges. But his designation meant little to the Dutch citizens peering from their windows. What mattered was his size. Denton stood at an imposing height, a full head and shoulders above his comrades, his frame suggesting a genetic throwback to an earlier, mightier line of men. His uniform, despite being the largest size manufactured, strained across shoulders that seemed carved from granite. His helmet, standard issue, looked comically small perched upon his large head. The initial reaction was a disbelieving hush. The Dutch, a tall people themselves, had never witnessed such a specimen. The irony of history is this: for years, Nazi propaganda had attempted to co-opt the concept of a Superman, the Aryan ideal of physical perfection. Yet the literal imposing embodiment of raw, overwhelming physical power had arrived with the forces of democracy, wearing the olive drab of an American GI. The myth had come from the wrong side. The atmosphere in that small, liberated square was electric. It was a mix of wonder, relief, and an almost primal fear. Fear not of the man himself, but of the sheer scale of the conflict he represented. If this was the individual fighting for them, what colossal forces were arrayed against him? The true turning point, the moment that solidified Silas Denton's transformation from a very large man into a local legend, came later that afternoon. A handcart, piled high with salvageable debris, a forgotten relic of the German retreat, had been carelessly overturned in the middle of a crucial intersection, blocking the passage of a light tank. The soldiers cursed and struggled, attempting to right the heavy, iron-wheeled vehicle, but it was wedged awkwardly and proved immovable. The local Dutch civilians watched silently, assessing the competence of their liberators. This small technical failure threatened to break the celebratory mood. Then PFC Denton lumbered forward. With an economy of movement that belied his massive bulk, he surveyed the cart. He didn't heave or grunt. Instead, he simply knelt, wrapped 2 massive hands around the frame, and with a controlled, steady exertion, he didn't just move the cart. He lifted it. He lifted the entire cart. its load and iron wheels off the ground, pivoted with the weight held waist-high, and placed it gently on the curb, as if it were a child's toy. The silence in the square was absolute, shattered only by the metallic clank as the cart settled. The Dutch onlookers, many of whom had risked their lives in the resistance, stared, their mouths agape. A young Dutch woman, later quoted in a war correspondence report, simply whispered, "Wij konden het niet geloven. Hij was zo groot, totdat hij de kar zelf optilde. We couldn't believe it. He was so huge until he lifted the cart by himself." The myth of De Royce was born. It was an event that instantly transcended the bureaucratic anonymity of military service. Denton was no longer just a PFC. He was an elemental force. This is the central contradiction we must explore. In an industrialized war where victory was measured in the tonnage of bombs and the sheer numbers of manufactured tanks, a single human being's raw, anachronistic strength could still hold a disproportionate sway over the hearts and minds of the people he was fighting to free. This incident, seemingly minor, immediately shifted the dynamics of the local war effort, giving the civilians a tangible, almost folkloric symbol of their salvation. The news, as whispers often do in times of war, traveled faster than any radio transmission. Within hours, the tale had been embellished. He hadn't just lifted a cart, he had righted a damaged half-track. He hadn't just righted a half-track, he had single-handedly carried a wounded man over a minefield. The Germans, still lurking a mere kilometre away across the marsh, would soon hear these tales, and they would begin to adjust their strategy accordingly. But PFC. Silas Denton, the man at the centre of this burgeoning myth, was oblivious to the legend he was creating. He was focused on his next objective, clearing a blocked culvert before the advancing column could proceed. The simple, brutal fact was that war, even with its technology, still required manual labour, and Denton, the giant, was merely a tool of unparalleled efficacy. This episode sets the stage for the rest of our journey. How does this personal, almost medieval force of nature navigate a modern, mechanized battlefield? How does his overwhelming physical presence affect his comrades, his enemy, and the strategic decisions made in the fog of war? Stay with us as we delve deeper into the shadow cast by the giant, exploring how a myth can become a weapon. The Second World War was, fundamentally, a war of production, a contest of industrial capacity. Yet the story of Silas Denton reminds us that every piece of machinery, every shell fired, had to be moved, loaded, and maintained by human hands. To understand the giant, we must first understand the military doctrine that deployed him. Denton was not a frontline combat infantryman, he was an engineer. His role was to build and to break, to ensure the relentless forward momentum of the Allied juggernaut. The technological leap in military hardware during the 1940s meant that the sheer mass of equipment, the M4 Sherman tanks, the heavy bridging apparatus, the massive stores of ammunition, necessitated men who could handle overwhelming weight. Denton's immense physical attributes, born of a long lineage of farmers and laborers from rural Montana, were a serendipitous fit for the logistical demands of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. His training was not in marksmanship or fieldcraft, but in the rapid construction of Bailey bridges and the complex deployment of Bangalore torpedoes. His commander, Major Alan Rourke, a logistics officer with a keen, pragmatic mind, saw Denton not as an oddity, but as an almost irreplaceable mechanical asset. Rourke kept Denton close, utilizing his power for tasks that would otherwise require heavy lifting gear, saving precious time and reducing the logistical tail. He was better than a field crane on short notice, Rourke would later write in his service journal. We saved countless man-hours and almost certainly prevented the loss of a couple of vehicles stuck in the mud that no amount of winch cable could budge. Denton just pushed. To the average GI, Denton was a figure of quiet awe and occasional respectful fear. He ate 3 times the rations of a typical man, and his custom-fitted gear, oversized boots, reinforced straps, spoke to his distinctness. But he was rarely boastful. His presence, however, offered a psychological boost. In the mud, rain, and unending fatigue of the European theatre, the sight of a man effortlessly managing a burden that would crush 4 others was a visceral reminder of American strength and ingenuity, the idea that even the men themselves were engineered for victory. This is where the precision of technology meets the inaccuracy of human perception. While Denton was a tool of his unit, the German High Command, the Oberkommando des Heeres, OKH, received intelligence reports filtered through the lens of terror. The retreat through the Netherlands had been disorderly. Reports from demoralized, often injured German troops crossing the Maas River described a man, a monster of a man, capable of feats that strained credulity. One particular engagement elevated the giant from local myth to tactical concern. Our German patrol, attempting to secure a key canal lock north of Tilburg, encountered Denton's small engineering squad. The American objective was simple: set demolition charges to deny the Germans the use of the lock. The German objective: prevent the demolition at all costs. The ensuing firefight was brief and brutal. In the confusion, a heavy, air-cooled MG-42 machine gun, the infamous Hitler's buzzsaw, was brought to bear on the American position. The sustained rate of fire from the MG-42, up to 1,200 rounds per minute, was the defining sound of German tactical superiority, a psychological weapon that pinned down entire platoons. As the squad leader screamed for cover, the key demolition charge, a heavy box of tetryl explosives, was dropped and slid precariously close to the canal bank. The Germans were closing in. In a move that defied military convention and the basic physics of the battlefield, Denton didn't dive for cover. Instead, he stood, took 3 deliberate steps through the incoming fire, and with his body acting as a massive shield against the spray of bullets, he bent and retrieved the charge. A German soldier, Feldwebel Klaus Richter, the squad leader in charge of the machine gun nest, later described the scene during interrogation. "The bullets were hitting him," Richter stated, his voice still shaky, "but they did nothing. I saw the sparks. He was like a walking tank. He simply picked up the box and walked away slowly. We fired everything we had. It was useless. The strategy was useless." Richter was technically wrong. The bullets did hit him, tearing through his webbing and equipment, leaving superficial wounds and deep bruises. Denton's size did not grant him invulnerability, but his sheer density, combined with the rapid, adrenaline-fueled focus on a single objective, the tetryl charge, allowed him to survive what should have been a fatal encounter. This is the turning point for the enemy's perception. The failure of the MG-42, the pinnacle of German small arms technology, against the raw defiance of one man, sent a chilling message up the chain of command. In a war where morale was the most volatile of variables, the appearance of an adversary who seemed to negate the best of their engineering was catastrophic. OKH began circulating descriptions of this giant engineer, suggesting he might be an example of a new, biologically engineered Allied super soldier, a terrifying prospect designed to sow discord and panic among German units facing the Western Front. The irony is profound. The Germans, masters of technological warfare and the inventors of the propaganda Übermensch, were now the victims of a myth generated by a simple, giant American farmer doing his job. The sophisticated technological battlefield had suddenly been overlaid with a primitive, almost mythical threat. The stage is now set for a strategic confrontation, where the simple fact of a man's size becomes a deliberate psychological weapon. The reports filtering through the Allied command structure regarding Private First Class Silas Denton were treated with a mixture of amusement and growing strategic interest. Major Rorke's immediate superiors, initially skeptical of the inflated claims, began to observe a verifiable pattern. Units where Denton was deployed showed significantly lower logistical bottlenecks and, critically, markedly higher morale among the attached infantry. The man who truly recognized the potential of the giant's shadow was Colonel William Vance, a staff officer with a background in psychological warfare. Vance understood that warfare in 1944 was fought as much in the minds of the enemy as in the trenches. He saw Denton not just as an engineer, but as a low-cost, high-impact psychological operation. Vance's plan was audacious: to intentionally exaggerate Denton's capabilities and use his presence to influence German defensive planning. The tease: if the enemy believes a specific position is defended or targeted by an invulnerable force, they will commit disproportionate resources or, conversely, retreat prematurely. The shift in command strategy was subtle but calculated. Denton was no longer assigned to anonymous construction details. He was deliberately sent to high-visibility, low-risk areas where German observers were known to be active. His activities, clearing massive obstacles, moving heavy equipment, reinforcing breaches, were performed openly, often near forward observation posts. Furthermore, Vance ensured that information was leaked through double agents and captured documents. Reports that suggested Denton was not one man, but the prototype of a new elite Goliath squad, genetically enhanced soldiers deployed only for breaking fortified positions. This was a masterful use of historical irony. While the Allies fought for the reality of freedom and democracy, they were not above using the mythology of the enemy against them. They were creating their own super-soldier narrative, mirroring the propaganda they were fighting against. The Germans, suffering from the relentless attrition on the Eastern Front, and now the overwhelming material superiority of the West, were desperately searching for reasons for their failures. The introduction of a seemingly unkillable giant adversary provided a convenient, albeit terrifying, explanation. The fear became a palpable tactical factor. Major Johann Breuer, a German battalion commander responsible for defending the vital city of Arnhem against the potential northern thrust of the Allied army, received a specific intelligence dossier on the Goliath unit. Breuer, a pragmatic veteran of the Russian steppes, was initially dismissive. He trusted steel and concrete, not folklore. However, the documentation provided was compelling, purported American biological engineering schematics, and, crucially, a detailed list of engagements where overwhelming Allied victory was directly attributed to the unconventional strength of the giants. Breuer was now faced with a crippling strategic dilemma. He was defending a critical river crossing, a textbook objective for an American breakthrough. If the intelligence was accurate, committing his small reserve of self-propelled guns against regular infantry was justifiable, but deploying them against Goliaths, creatures impervious to standard small arms fire, would be a suicidal waste of precious armor needed for the eventual inevitable defense of the German heartland. Breuer's account, taken from his private war diary, reveals the psychological toll. 10 November 1944. The reports of these Americans are infecting the troops. They speak of a creature that lifted a Kübelwagen with one hand. I dismiss it as typical retreat panic, but command insists. If I commit the last 4 Sturmgeschütz III Ausfuß to this crossing, and the reports are true, I have sacrificed my ability to hold the bridgehead for nothing. If the reports are false and I do not commit them, I risk a breakthrough. I find myself fighting not the enemy's steel, but their stories. This is the power of the giant shadow. Colonel Vance had successfully introduced an element of crippling uncertainty into the German OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. Major Breuer was now paralyzed, forced to factor a mythical creature into a purely logistical, strategic decision. The delay in his decision to deploy the limited German armor, a direct result of the fear of Denton's mythical invulnerability, provided a crucial window for the Allied engineers to complete their work, establishing a temporary but vital pontoon bridge several kilometers downriver. Silas Denton, oblivious to the high-stakes game of psychological chess being played using his likeness, continued his work. He saw the strategic value not in his size, but in the efficiency he brought to his actual technical task. He simply wanted to get the job done and go home. His humility, ironically, only fueled the myth, making him seem like a creature of pure, unassuming power. The transformation is complete. Denton is no longer an individual. He is a tool, a piece of psychological weaponry wielded by the Allied High Command. The next act will explore the inevitable climax, the moment when the myth must confront the harsh technical reality of the battlefield. The Germans are preparing a trap designed not for a man, but for a giant. The danger of any effective lie is the belief it inspires. While Colonel Vance's psychological campaign was succeeding in freezing German armor deployment, it also unintentionally put Private First Class Denton in extreme danger. The enemy, believing they faced an engineered prototype impervious to bullets, began to plan a counter-strategy based entirely on anti-tank weaponry and high-explosive ordnance. They ceased to view him as a man and started viewing him as a target category: heavy armor. The German trap was set in the small marshy village of Wienendahl. a key logistical bottleneck that the Allies needed to secure to push towards the Rhine. Denton's engineering squad was tasked with clearing a heavily mined road and neutralizing a concrete pillbox that guarded the main thoroughfare. The German defenders, a battle-hardened company of Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers, had been specifically briefed on the Goliath. Their commander, Captain Heinrich Voss, was under immense pressure from Breuer's command to provide hard proof of the myth's falsity or its terrifying truth. Voss was pragmatic. He knew bullets wouldn't stop a tank, and if the giant was like a tank, he would treat him as such. His primary weapon for the task was the Panzerschreck, a powerful, shoulder-fired anti-tank rocket launcher, essentially a German version of the American bazooka, firing an 80 meter rocket. It was designed to pierce 160 meters of rolled homogeneous armor, a definitive overmatch for any human being, no matter their size. The morning of the assault was typical of late autumn, cold, foggy, and quiet. Denton's squad moved forward, his massive silhouette immediately drawing the eye. He was a beacon, a target impossible to miss. As the squad began the painstaking work of clearing the anti-personnel mines, the silence was shattered by the sharp crack of a rifle, quickly followed by the distinct sound of a distant, powerful launch. The first Panzerschreck rocket sliced through the fog. It was aimed not at the squad, but at the pillbox immediately behind them. A calculated miss designed to force the engineers to scatter. The blast was deafening, a gout of smoke and earth that rattled the teeth of every man present. It was a clear statement from Voss. "We know who you are, and we are using what kills tanks." Denton's immediate reaction was not that of a mythical hero, but of a highly trained engineer. He knew the protocol. Enemy anti-armor fire meant the objective was compromised. But the primary goal was still the pillbox, which housed the German forward observation team. The squad leader was down, hit by a sniper. This is the crucial twist of the myth's confrontation with reality. Denton was a giant, yes, but he was also human, vulnerable, fearful, and driven by training. But the myth had prepared him for this moment in a way his physical training had not. He knew his size was a target. He knew that if he moved quickly, he drew fire away from his exposed, injured comrades. He made a conscious, terrifying choice to use his myth as a shield. Ignoring the shouts of his remaining team members, Denton grabbed a massive coil of communication wire and a heavy pack of plastic explosives. He began to run, a heavy, lumbering charge straight towards the pillbox, traversing the remaining 100 meters of mined-exposed ground. Captain Voss, watching from his command post, was staggered. "Schieße," he hissed. "He is not seeking cover. He thinks he is truly invulnerable." Voss ordered the second Panzerschreck team to fire directly at the charging figure. The projectile was fast. It struck Denton not head-on, but on his side, glancing off his reinforced pack and detonating approximately 5 feet away. The force of the explosion, designed to rip through steel, was enough to lift the 300-pound man completely off his feet and slam him into the muddy earth. Silence. The Fallschirmjäger held their breath. They had struck a tank with the equivalent of a small artillery shell. No man could survive that. They had exposed the flaw in the myth. But they had not accounted for the sheer physical mass and constitution of Private First-Class Denton, nor the luck of the strike. The pack of explosives and the roll of copper wire had absorbed just enough of the blast's kinetic energy, and his custom-made reinforced field jacket, designed for cold weather and heavy abrasion, had provided a fraction of extra protection. He was brutally wounded, bleeding profusely from shrapnel in his leg and side, concussed but alive. More importantly, he was within yards of the pillbox, his mission still primary. Dragging himself through the mud, relying on a primal surge of adrenaline and sheer will, he reached the pillbox's firing slit. With a final, desperate exertion, he managed to shove the entire satchel of explosives into the opening and arm the charge. He then collapsed, rolling away just before the earth-shattering blast ripped the concrete structure apart, silencing the German observation post instantly. The cost was devastating. Denton was pulled back by his surviving team, critically wounded. But the objective was taken. The strategic importance of the capture was immediate, but the legend's impact was far greater. The irony is now complete. Denton survived the anti-tank weapon precisely because the Germans believed he was impervious to bullets. Had Voss ordered his men to concentrate small arms fire first, Denton would have been cut down before he covered half the distance. Instead, they overmatched the weapon to the target, and in doing so, they failed to kill him. The myth saved the man, even as it nearly destroyed him. The flaw in the myth was that it overlooked the human element, the determination of a soldier to finish his task. Silas Denton was evacuated, fading in and out of consciousness. The journey from the muddy fields of Veenendaal to the 10th Evacuation Hospital near Antwerp was a stark transition from the brutal theatre of war to the cold, clinical reality of industrial medicine. Here the mythology surrounding him was stripped away, piece by nurses, surgeons and orderlies, focused only on the biology of a massive, heavily wounded body. The surgeons, wrestling with shrapnel and blast trauma, were momentarily thrown by the sheer scale of the man they were treating. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, a pioneering orthopedic surgeon who operated on Denton, later recalled, "His muscle density was extraordinary. We had to adjust our standard dosages for anesthesia and pain management. It wasn't just a large man, it was a man built like an oak tree. We were operating not on a hero, but on a unique biological specimen that had simply refused to die." Denton's stay in the evac hospital was critical for the narrative on both sides of the front. For the Americans, his absence created a strategic vacuum. Colonel Vance's psychological operation was immediately compromised. Reports of the Goliath halting in Veenendaal, severely wounded, began to leak. Vance had to scramble to maintain the illusion, fabricating reports of the Goliath unit being rotated out for enhancement. But the German reaction was the most telling. When Captain Voss reported the successful use of the Panzerschreck, he expected commendation. Instead, he received only a cold rebuke. The fact that the target had been hit and wounded, but had still completed his mission, was interpreted by Major Brewer as proof of the Goliath unit's resilience. The propaganda by this point had become so ingrained that evidence of humanity, wounding, collapsing, was reinterpreted as proof of inhuman tenacity. The myth, once created, possessed a terrifying inertia. Breuer wrote in his diary, "The engineer was hit by the Panzerschreck, yet he completed the destruction of the pillbox before collapsing. This is not the action of a mortal man. It is a drone, programmed for a single objective. We must assume the Goliath unit is temporarily disabled, but will return stronger. The anti-tank weapon was ineffective as a killing tool, only a disabling one. We must now prepare for a new, stronger deployment." The human cost of the lie was about to be paid. Denton's slow recovery in the hospital provided a crucial moment of human connection that stood in stark contrast to his wartime persona. A young Dutch nurse, Else van Dijk, volunteered to assist with his physical therapy. Else had lost her father during the occupation and initially viewed Denton with the same fearful awe as the civilians back home. To her, he was the symbol of the crushing, industrial power that had saved them. But she soon found a quiet, deeply gentle man beneath the legendary exterior. Denton, speaking in slow, halting sentences due to the concussion, was worried about the farm equipment he had left behind in Montana and the cold snap that might ruin the winter crop. He spoke not of battles, but of soil, weather, and the sheer effort of manual labor. Nurse Van Dijk's testimony years later captured the essential truth. "I remember looking at his hands. They were enormous but scarred, calloused and surprisingly careful when he would try to grip a small cup. Those hands, which had lifted a heavy cart, now struggled to pick up a tiny pill. I realized he wasn't a tank or a myth. He was a piece of machinery that had been misused and broken, but the engine beneath was a human heart. When I saw him weep silently one night, not from pain but from the fear of disappointing his unit, I knew the real story was not about his size, but his enormous, heavy burden of responsibility. This humanizing moment is the center of our narrative. The myth of the invincible giant gave the Allies strategic advantage, but it imposed a crushing psychological weight on Silas Denton. He was aware of the rumors, and he knew he had to live up to them, even if it meant risking his life in ways a conventional soldier never would. The narrative was becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, forcing the man to become the legend. The German command, convinced the Goliath was only temporarily withdrawn, began to expend vast critical resources fortifying the sector where Denton had been wounded, diverting armor and artillery from far more critical positions further north. This was the true strategic victory of the giant's shadow. The wounded giant was now more effective as a threat than he was as a soldier. Against medical advice and driven by an overwhelming sense of duty, and perhaps the weight of the myth he bore, Private First Class Silas Denton insisted on returning to his unit in late December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge had erupted, and every available man, regardless of his specialization, was needed to contain the massive German counter-offensive in the Ardennes. Denton was reassigned to a small, isolated forward operating base, FOB, near the Belgian town of Stavelot, tasked with assisting in the construction of temporary defensive earthworks. This was a sector of incredible vulnerability, where small dispersed American units were fighting desperately to hold ground against superior German armor, specifically elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division, led by hardened veterans who knew little of fear and nothing of retreat. The German advance was swift and brutal, driven by the desperation of their last major offensive. The Americans were ill-equipped to handle the heavy German tanks, such as the Panther and the feared Königstiger, King Tiger. The primary objective of the American unit at Stavelot was to hold a key bridge over the Amblev River, a choke point essential for blocking the German advance towards Liège. On the third day of the offensive, the American FOB came under direct assault. The fog of the Ardennes, already thick, was made impenetrable by the smoke of burning vehicles. Denton, still recovering and moving with a noticeable limp, was thrown into a desperate close-quarters infantry fight, a scenario far outside his engineering brief. As the German infantry and a leading column of 3 Panther tanks closed in, the American position began to crumble. The forward anti-tank gun, a critical 57mm piece, was knocked out by a high-explosive shell, and the gun crew was wiped out. The bridge was about to fall. The final confrontation between myth and machine was at hand. Denton knew he could not stop the tanks, but he knew from his engineering training how to disable them. His plan was reckless, a desperate final act of a man who had internalized his own legend. He grabbed the last 3 remaining satchel charges, powerful demolition bags designed to be placed directly against the tank's armor. These charges were heavy, clumsy, and required the user to be within feet of the tank. As the lead Panther, a monster of steel weighing over 45 tons rumbled onto the bridge, its 75mm cannon traversing, Silas Denton made his move. He emerged from the smoke, running straight towards the tank's flank. The Panther's machine gunner immediately spotted the massive figure, the unmistakable shape of the Goliath. The terror of the myth, now working in close-quarters combat, bought Denton the precious seconds he needed. The gunner hesitated. He had been briefed that this creature was bullet-resistant, and firing a conventional machine gun would only reveal his position without effect, inviting a mythical, overwhelming counterattack. The gunner instead reported, "Der Ries, the giant," to the tank commander, requesting permission to use the main cannon, a time-consuming process. That moment of hesitation, the enemy's pause caused by the fear of the myth, was the strategic opening Denton had created. He reached the side of the Panther, slapped the first satchel charge onto the drive sprocket, and armed the timer. He repeated the action for the second and third charge against the second tank's track and the third tank's engine compartment. He was working not with skill but with overwhelming force and speed. The German infantry, paralyzed by the sight of the giant seemingly wrestling with their tanks, failed to react until it was too late. The first charge detonated with a colossal roar, shattering the drive sprocket of the lead Panther, immediately immobilizing the tank and effectively blocking the narrow bridge. The second charge ripped the track off the second tank. The third, placed in the engine compartment of the last tank, caused a catastrophic fire. Denton, his face streaked with sweat and soot, didn't wait. He collapsed back into the American lines, completely spent, but the job was done. The German advance was halted at the river. Stavelot was saved, and the German drive towards the critical American supply hub was crippled. The reckoning was complete. The man, Silas Denton, had fought and suffered, but the myth of De Royce, the invincible giant, had provided the psychological leverage to achieve a tactical impossibility. The hesitation of one German machine gunner, believing in a legend, saved a crucial bridge and, perhaps, the entire American sector. The ultimate irony, In the most technological war in history, victory was secured by a man's brute strength, amplified by a propaganda story. The Battle of the Bulge marked the climax and effective end of Private First Class Silas Denton's active service. His wounds from the Panzerschreck were exacerbated by the final desperate charge at Stavelot, leading to his final evacuation back to the United States. He was awarded the Silver Star for his actions, an official recognition of a hero, even as the legend that enabled his heroism remained undocumented and uncredited in the official citations. Denton never spoke publicly about his service during the war, particularly about the label of the Giant. He was discharged and returned to the quiet anonymity of his Montana farm. He traded the weight of satchel charges for the weight of sacks of feed, and the roar of the panther for the quiet hum of a tractor. For him, the war was a job that needed doing, and his size was merely an unwanted complication that he had managed to turn into a tool. But the legacy he left in the Netherlands and the German command structure was indelible. For the Dutch people, de Ruyss became an enduring figure of the liberation. He was the simple, overwhelming symbol of the raw, uncompromising power of the American intervention. The story of the man who lifted the cart by himself was repeated for generations, a local folktale that cemented the idea that their liberators were not just armies, but individuals of exceptional heroic qualities. He represented the visible, human face of a colossal industrial war machine. For the German military, the Goliath unit became a post-war footnote, a case study in how effective psychological warfare could be, even if based on a physical anomaly rather than pure fiction. The overexpenditure of resources in the Veenendaal sector and the crucial hesitation at Stavelot were cited in military academies as textbook examples of how psychological vulnerability could override sound tactical decision-making. Major Breuer, in his final interrogation report, concluded, "They did not send a new weapon, they sent a new concept of fear, and we, the technologically superior, were defeated by a myth." The real legacy of Silas Denton is the profound exploration of human scale in an industrial war. The Second World War was defined by the B-17 bomber, the radar dish, and the M4 tank. Yet our journey has revealed that even in the most technological of conflicts, a single human being's presence, his unique attributes, and the perception of those attributes could become a decisive factor. The irony endures. The Allies won because of superior production, logistics, and technology, but the final crucial difference was made by a man whose strength was primitive, ancient, and undeniable. Denton was the final non-mechanized weapon in the Allied arsenal, a human-scale symbol of overwhelming force. He was the man who was too big to be a regular soldier, and whose actions were so large they became a legend. He carried not just heavy explosives, but the immense crushing weight of a symbol. When Private First Class Silas Denton lifted that cart in a Dutch square, he lifted the morale of a desperate population, and he lifted the fear of a desperate enemy. He lifted the fog of war just enough for everyone to see, for a moment, the immense, simple power of a dedicated man. He was the Giant, he was a myth, and he was just an engineer doing his job. We hope you've been captivated by this deep dive into the intersection of myth, technology, and humanity in World War II. If the incredible, untold stories of the Second World War and the men and women who shaped it intrigue you, then be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Join us next time as we uncover another layer of history's great and complex dramas.